Go straight over to the House of Commons for a special session of Parliament.
LGOM. I call the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the motion. In the long history of this Parliament, Margaret Thatcher was our first, and so far our only, woman Prime Minister. She won 3 elections in a row, serving this country for a longer continuous period than any Prime Minister for more than 150 years. She defined and she overcame the great challenges of her age, and it is right that Parliament has been recalled to mark our respect. Mr. Speaker, it is also right that next Wednesday Lady Thatcher's coffin will be draped with the flag that she loved. It will be placed on a gun carriage and taken to St Paul's Cathedral, and members of all 3 services will line the route. This will be a fitting salute to a great Prime Minister. Today, we in the House of Commons are here to pay our own tributes to an extraordinary leader and an extraordinary woman. What she achieved, even before her 3 terms in office, was remarkable. Those of us who grew up when Margaret Thatcher was already in Downing Street can sometimes fail to appreciate the thickness of the glass ceiling that she broke through, from a grocer's shop in Grantham to the highest office in the land. At a time when it was difficult for a woman to become a member of Parliament, almost inconceivable that one could lead the Conservative Party, and by her own reckoning, virtually impossible that a woman could become Prime Minister, she did all 3. It is also right to remember that she spent her whole premiership, and indeed much of her life, under direct personal threat from the IRA. She lost 2 of her closest friends and closest parliamentary colleagues, Airey Neave and Ian Gow, to terrorism. And of course she herself was only inches away from death in the Brighton bomb attack of 1984. And yet it was the measure of her leadership that she shook off the dust from that attack, and in just a few hours later gave an outstanding conference speech reminding us all why democracy must never give in to terror. Margaret Thatcher was a woman of great contrasts. She could be incredibly formidable in argument, yet wonderfully kind in private. In number 10 Downing Street today, there are still people who worked with her as Prime Minister, and they talk of her fondly. One assistant tells of when she got drenched in a downpour on a trip to Cornwall, and Margaret Thatcher personally made sure she was looked after and found her herself a set of dry clothes. Of course, she did always prefer dries to wets. On another occasion, one assistant had put in a handwritten note to Mrs. Thatcher saying, "Please, can you re-sign this minute?" Unfortunately, she had left off the hyphen, leaving a note that actually read, "Please, can you resign this minute?" To which the Prime Minister politely replied, "Thank you, dear, but I'd rather not." Margaret Thatcher was faultlessly kind to her staff and utterly devoted to her family. For more than 50 years, Dennis was always at her side, an invaluable confidant and friend. Of her, he said this: "I've been married to one of the greatest women the world has ever produced. All I could produce, small as it may be, was love and loyalty." We know just how important the support of her family and friends were to Margaret, and I know that today everyone in this House will wish to send our most heartfelt condolences to her children, Carol and Mark, to her grandchildren, and to her many, many loyal friends. She was always incredibly kind to me, and it was a huge honour to welcome her to Downing Street shortly after I became Prime Minister, something that when I started working for her in 1988, I never dreamed I would do. And Mr. Speaker, as this day of tributes begins, I would like to acknowledge that there are members of here in this House today from all parties who profoundly disagreed with Mrs. Thatcher, but who've come here today willing to pay their respects. And let me say to those honourable members, your generosity of spirit does you great credit, and it speaks more eloquently than any one person can of the strength and the spirit of British statesmanship and British democracy. Margaret Thatcher was a remarkable type of leader. She said very clearly, "I am not a consensus politician, but a conviction politician." she could sum up those convictions, linked profoundly with her upbringing and values, in just a few short phrases. Sound money, strong defence, liberty under the rule of law. You shouldn't spend what you haven't earned. Governments don't create wealth, businesses do that. The clarity of these convictions was applied with great courage to the problems of the age. And the scale of her achievements is only apparent when you look back to Britain in the 1970s. Successive governments had failed to deal with what was beginning to be called the British disease. Appalling industrial relations, poor productivity, persistently high inflation. Though it seems absurd today, the state had got so big that it owned our airports and airline, the phones in our houses, trucks on our roads. The state even owned a removal company. The air was thick with defeatism. There was a sense that the role of government was simply to manage decline. Margaret Thatcher rejected this defeatism. She had a clear view about what needed to change. Inflation was to be controlled, not by incomes policies, but by monetary and fiscal discipline. Industries were to be set free into the private sector. Trade unions should be handed back to their members. People should be able to buy their own council homes. Success in these endeavours was never assured. Her political story was one of a perpetual battle in the country, in this place, and sometimes even in her own cabinet too. Of course, her career could have taken an entirely different path. In the late 1940s, before she entered politics, the then Margaret Roberts went for a job at ICI. The personnel department rejected her application and afterwards wrote this: "This woman is headstrong, obstinate and dangerously self-opinionated." Mr. Speaker, even her closest friends would agree she could be all of those things. But the point is this: she used that conviction and that resolve in the service of our country, and we are all the better for that. Mr. Speaker, Margaret Thatcher was also a great parliamentarian. She loved and respected this place and was for many years its finest debater. She was utterly fastidious in her preparations. I was a junior party researcher in the 1980s, and the trauma of preparation for Prime Minister's questions is still seared into my memory. Twice a week, it was as if the arms of a giant octopus shook every building in Whitehall for every analysis of every problem, every answer to every question. And her respect for Parliament was instilled into others. Early in her first government, a junior minister was seen running through the lobby. His hair was dishevelled, and he was carrying both a heavy box and a full tray of papers on his arm. Another member cried out, "Slow down, Rome wasn't built in a day." To which the minister replied, "Yes, but Margaret Thatcher wasn't the foreman on that job." As Tony Blair, rightly in my view, said this week, Margaret Thatcher was one of the very few leaders who changed not only the political landscape in their own country, but in the rest of the world too. She was no starry-eyed internationalist, but again her approach was rooted in some simple and clear principles. Strength abroad begins with strength at home. Deterrence, not appeasement. The importance of national sovereignty, which is why she fought so passionately for Britain's interests in Europe and always believed that Britain should keep its own currency. Above all, she believed to the core of her being that Britain stood for something in the world, for democracy, for the rule of law, for right over might. She loathed communism and believed in the invincible power of the human spirit to resist and ultimately defeat tyranny. She never forgot that Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, these were great European cities, capitals of free nations, temporarily trapped behind the Iron Curtain. Today, in different corners of the world, there are millions of people who know that they owe their freedom in part to Margaret Thatcher. In Kuwait, which she helped free from Saddam's jackboot, across Eastern and Central Europe, and of course, in the Falkland Islands. In a week from now, as people gather in London to lay Margaret Thatcher to rest, the sun will be rising over the Falklands. And because of her courage, and because of the skill and bravery and sacrifice of our armed forces, it will rise again for freedom. Mr. Speaker, much has been said about the battles that Margaret Thatcher fought, She certainly did not shy from the fight, and that led to arguments, to conflict, yes, even to division. But what is remarkable, looking back now, is how many of those arguments are no longer arguments at all. No one wants to return to strikes without a ballot. No one believes that large industrial companies should be owned by the state. The nuclear deterrent, NATO, the special relationship, these are widely accepted as the cornerstones of our security and defence policies. We argue, sometimes very passionately, in this House about tax, but none of us is arguing for a return to tax rates of 98%. So many of the principles that Lady Thatcher fought for are now part of the accepted political landscape of our country. As Winston Churchill once put it, there are some politicians who make the weather, and Margaret Thatcher was undoubtedly one of them. Mr. Speaker, in the members' lobby of the House of Commons, there are rightly 4 principal statues. Lloyd George, who gave us the beginnings of the welfare state; Winston Churchill, who gave us victory in war; Clement Attlee, who gave us the NHS; and Margaret Thatcher, who rescued our country from post-war decline. They say, cometh the hour, cometh the man. Well, in 1979 came the hour and came the lady. She made the political weather, she made history, and let this be her epitaph, that she made our country great again. And I commend this motion to the House.
Order. The question is that this House has considered the matter of tributes to the Right Honourable the Baroness Thatcher of Kesteven LGOM. Mr. Edward Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I want to join the Prime Minister in commemorating the extraordinary life and unique contribution of Margaret Thatcher. And I want to join him in sending my deepest condolences to her children, Carol and Mark, the whole family, and her many, many close friends. Today is an opportunity for us to reflect on Margaret Thatcher's personal achievements, her style of politics, and her political legacy. And as the Prime Minister said, the journey from being the child of a grocer to Downing Street is an unlikely one. And it is particularly remarkable because she was the daughter, not the son, of a grocer. At each stage of her life, she broke the mould. A woman at Oxford when there was not a single woman in the university who held a full professorship. A woman chemist when most people assumed scientists had to be men. A woman candidate for Parliament in 1950 against the opposition of some in her local party in Dartford at the age of only 24. A woman MP in 1959 when just 4% of MPs in the whole of this House were women. The only woman in the cabinet when she was appointed in 1970, and of course, the first woman Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it is no wonder she remarked as early as 1965 in a speech to the National Union of Town Women's Guilds Conference, in politics, if you want anything said, ask a man. If you want anything done, ask a woman. I'm sure some people in this House, I was going to say, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure some people in this House, and no doubt many more in the country, will agree with this sentiment. Having broken so many conventions as a woman, it can't be a coincidence that she was someone who in so many other areas of life was willing to take on the established orthodoxies. Margaret Thatcher's ability to overcome every obstacle in her path is just one measure of her personal strength. And that takes me to her style of politics. You can disagree with Margaret Thatcher, but it is important to understand the kind of political leader she was. What was unusual was that she sought to be rooted in people's daily lives, but she also believed that ideology mattered. Not for her the contempt sometimes heaped on ideas and new thinking in political life. And while she never would have claimed to be or wanted to be seen as an intellectual, she believed and she showed that ideas matter in politics. In 1945, Mr. Speaker, before the end of the war, she bought a copy of Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom. There is even a story that she suggested that Conservative Central Office distribute it in the 1945 general election campaign. She said it left a permanent mark on my political character. And nobody can grasp Margaret Thatcher's achievements and Thatcherism without also appreciating the ideas that were its foundation, and the way in which they departed from the prevailing consensus of the time. In typical homespun style, on breakfast TV, she said this in 1995: "Consensus doesn't give you any direction. It is like mixing all the constituent ingredients together and not coming out with a cake. Democracy is about the people being given a choice." It was that approach that enabled her to define the politics of a whole generation and influence the politics of generations to come. The Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, and I all came of age in the 1980s, when you defined your politics by being for or against what she was doing. It's fair to say we took different paths. 30 years on, the people of Britain still argue about her legacy. She was right to understand the sense of aspiration of people across the country. She was right to recognise our economy needed to change. She said in 1982 how absurd it will seem in a few years' time that the state ran Pickford's removals and the Gleneagles Hotel. She was right. And in foreign policy, she was right to defend the Falklands and bravely reach out to new leadership in the Soviet Union. And something often forgotten, Mr. Speaker, she was the first political leader in any major country to warn of the dangers of climate change, long before anyone thought of hugging a husky. But it would be dishonest. But it would be dishonest and not in keeping with the principles that Margaret Thatcher stood for, even on this day, not to be open with this House about the strong opinions and the deep divisions there were and are over what she did. In mining areas like the one I represent, communities felt angry and abandoned. Gay and lesbian people felt stigmatised by measures like Section 28, which today's Conservative Party has rightly repudiated. And it was no accident that when he became leader of the Conservative Party, the Right Honourable Member for Chingford wrote a pamphlet called "There is Such a Thing as Society." And on the world stage, as this Prime Minister rightly said in 2006 when he was leader of the opposition, she made the wrong judgment about Nelson Mandela and about sanctions in South Africa. Mr. Speaker, debates about her and what she represented will continue for many years to come. This is a mark of her significance as a political leader, someone with deep convictions, willing to act on them. As she put it, politics is more when you have convictions than a matter of multiple manoeuvrings to get you through the problems of the day. And as a person, nothing became her so much as the manner of her final years. The loss of her beloved husband, Dennis, and her struggle with illness. She bore both with the utmost dignity and courage. The same courage she showed decades earlier after the atrocity of the Brighton bombing. And Mr. Speaker, I will always remember seeing her at the cenotaph, in frail health, but determined to pay her respects to our troops and do her duty by the country. Whatever your view of her, Margaret Thatcher was a unique and towering figure. I disagree with much of what she did, but I respect what her death means to the many, many people who admired her, and I honour her personal achievements. On previous occasions, we've come to this House to remember the extraordinary Prime Ministers who have served our nation. Today we also remember a Prime Minister who defined her age.
Order. Mr. John Redwood.
Mr. Speaker, it is a pleasure to rise so soon after two such outstanding speeches. And on behalf of the House, I pay tribute to both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. They captured the essence of Margaret Thatcher, the woman, and the essence of Margaret Thatcher, the politician and stateswoman. And we are in their debt for getting our day off to such a superb start. I wish to be brief, but I would just like to put on record that she was the best boss I ever worked for. I was her chief policy advisor in the middle years, and then I subsequently was able to advise and help her a bit as a Member of Parliament and a junior minister. And she was that great figure because the private side of Margaret Thatcher was so different from the public side. Yes, many people beyond this House remember the woman who was so powerful in argument, who was so fierce in conviction. But what we saw, who worked with her closely, was someone who worked incredibly long hours with great energy and diligence because she was so keen to get it right. And she took a very wide range of advice. When you were working with Margaret Thatcher and you had an idea and you were putting it to her, not only did you need to produce all the evidence and the facts and go over it many times, but you knew that person after person coming to Downing Street was going to be given it as a kind of test. And they didn't know that they were part of a sort of running focus group, but your idea was there in front of the guests, and they were asked to shoot it down because she was so desperately concerned never to use the power of the great office without proper thought. And she was also so keen to make sure that before she did anything, she knew what the criticisms were going to be, she knew what might go wrong with it, she had tested it to destruction. And there's a lot to recommend it for those who are making mighty decisions, that they spend time, they take trouble, they go to a wide range of advice, and they make sure that something works well before it is put out there. Margaret Thatcher came in the middle of her period in office to be the champion of wider ownership and wider participation. And this, to me, was her at her best, when she could reach out beyond the confines of the Conservative Party she led so well in those days, and beyond the confines of her fairly solid 40% of voting support, much wider in the country. And a Prime Minister can become a great national leader when their ideas resonate more widely and when they become popular or they become taken up by those who would normally oppose. And it was that spirit of Margaret Thatcher which had fought her way as a schoolgirl to Oxford, and then as an Oxford graduate to Parliament, and then as a parliamentarian to the Cabinet, that made her feel that opportunity was there for people, but she recognised that it was very difficult, particularly for women, very difficult for people from certain backgrounds. And she was always telling us that it didn't matter where you came from, who your mother and father was, what mattered was what you could contribute. And that surely is a message that goes way beyond the confines of the Conservative Party or the years of her supremacy in Parliament. And it is something we should all remember. And when we tried to produce policies to reflect this more generally, we came up with the idea that owning a home had been the privilege of the richer part of society. And why couldn't it be something that everyone could aspire to, or practically everyone could aspire to? And that was where the council house sale idea gathered momentum. I know there were many people in the early days on the Labour benches who were very unhappy about this, and there still remain debates about it, but an awful lot of Labour voters and even some Labour councillors decided it was a really good policy and joined us with it, and I think it was one of those policies that reached out so much more widely. We tried to extend it into the ownership of big and small businesses with a big programme of wider share ownership and the employee elements and the public elements in the great privatisations, because she was determined to try and get Britain to break out of the debilitating cycle of decline that we'd witnessed under Labour and Conservative governments in the post-war years. Just one fact that the House might like to bear in mind for those who are very worried by the depressing number of jobs lost in the 1980s in the pits and in the steel industry is that the newly nationalised coal industry in the early 1950s had 700,000 employees, and by the time Margaret Thatcher came to office in 1979 there were only 235,000 of those jobs left. There had been a massive hemorrhage of jobs throughout the post-war period, and similar figures could be adduced for rail and for steel and the other commanding heights. It was that which drove her on to say there must be a better answer. There must be a way of modernising the old industries and bringing in the new industries. And one of her legacies is the modernisation of the car industry, which then gathered momentum under the Labour government and more recently under the coalition. Her other great triumph, I think, as the Prime Minister mentioned, was to extend this argument to a much wider audience around the world. And it was the export of the ideas of empowerment, enfranchisement, participation, of breaking industries up, of allowing competition and new ideas, allowing the public to be part of this process, which took off around the world and lay behind a lot of the spirit of revolution in Eastern Europe, which led to the bringing down of the Berlin Wall. And I think if we want a single picture that I will remember as a result of the Thatcher legacy, it is the tumbling of the Berlin Wall, the realisation that the path of enterprise and freedom adopted by all the democratic parties in this House is the right approach, and that tyranny and communism doesn't work. So, Mr. Speaker, a great lady, a great stateswoman, a huge personal achievement, a very big achievement politically, and at its best an achievement which broke free from conservatism, which broke free from party dogma, and showed the world that there is a better way, a democratic way, a freedom-loving way.
Mr. Nick Clegg.
On behalf of the Liberal Democrats, I'd like to pay tribute to Lady Thatcher. We send our sincere condolences to her family and friends, in particular her children Mark and Carol. Like all of us here, Mr. Speaker, who are not members of the Conservative Party, and as someone who disagreed with many of the things she did, I've thought long and hard about what to say. I'm also a Sheffield MP, a city where the mere mention of her name even now elicits strong reactions. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to think she'd perhaps be pleased that she still provokes trepidation and uncertainty amongst leaders of other parties, even when she's not here herself, eyeballing us across the House. Mr. Speaker, that those of us who are not from her party can shun the tenets of Thatcherism and yet still respect Margaret Thatcher is part of what was so remarkable about her. And it is in that spirit that I'd like to make three short observations. First, whether you liked her or disliked her, it is impossible to deny the indelible imprint Margaret Thatcher made both on the nation and the wider world. She was among those very rare leaders who became a towering historical figure, not as written in the history books, but when still in the prime of her political life. Whatever else is said about her, Margaret Thatcher created a paradigm, setting the parameters for economic, political and social debate for decades to come. She drew the lines on a political map that we here are still navigating today. Second, she was one of the most caricatured figures in modern British politics, yet she was easily one of the most complex. On the one hand, she's remembered as the eponymous ideologue, responsible for her own ism. Yet in reality, much of her politics was subtle, pragmatic, sometimes driven by events. Margaret Thatcher was a staunch patriot and much more comfortable reaching out across the Atlantic than across the Channel. Yet she participated in one of the most profound periods of European integration, she herself an architect of the single market. And while she was a conservative to her core, leading a party which traditionally likes to conserve things, she held a deep aversion to the status quo. She was restive about the future, determined to use politics as a force for reform, never fearing short-term disruption in pursuit of long-term change. In many ways a traditionalist, she was one of the most iconoclastic politicians of our age. So Margaret Thatcher was far from the cardboard cutout that is sometimes imagined. And for me, the best tribute to her is not to consign her to a simplified heroine or villain, but to remember her with all the nuance, unresolved complexity and paradox she possessed. Finally, Mr. Speaker, there was an extraordinary, even unsettling directness about her political presence. I remember vividly, aged 20, reading that Margaret Thatcher had said that there was no such thing as society. I was dismayed. It was not the kind of thing that a wide-eyed, idealistic social anthropology undergraduate wanted to hear. But with hindsight, what strikes me is that while I disagreed with the untempered individualism which those words implied, I never for a second thought that she was being cynical or that she was striking a pose or taking a position for short-term effect. You always knew with Margaret Thatcher that she believed what she said. It is interesting, Mr. Speaker, to reflect on how she would have reacted to today's political culture of 24-hour news, pollsters and focus groups. She seemed blissfully indifferent to the popularity of what she said, entirely driven instead by the conviction of what she said. Somehow her directness made you feel as if she was arguing directly with you, as if it was a clash of her convictions against yours. And as a result, you somehow felt as if you knew her, even if you did not. Whether she inspired or confronted, led or attacked, she did it all with uncluttered clarity. Mr. Speaker, her memory will no doubt continue to divide opinion and stir deep emotion. But as we as a nation say farewell to a figure who loomed so large, one thing's for sure. The memory of her will continue undimmed, strong and clear for years to come, in keeping with the unusual, unique character of Margaret Thatcher herself.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I begin by, on behalf of my right honourable and honourable friends, wishing our deepest sympathies to the family of Baroness Thatcher, to her children and to her grandchildren. I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, also for recalling Parliament. It's the right thing to do in this chamber, which she dominated for so long, that we, the representatives of the people of the United Kingdom, should meet here to pay tribute, but also to reflect on her long period in office. Baroness Thatcher was many things, Mr. Speaker. She was a pioneer, as has been said, the first female leader of a major political party in the United Kingdom, and the first female Prime Minister. She did break that glass ceiling, but she also broke through the social barrier standing in the way of anyone at that time and generation from becoming the leader of a major political party. She was a woman of personal and political courage, a politician of formidable ability, but a stateswoman who transformed not only the United Kingdom, but also played an enormous role in changing fundamentally the world order. Of course, there are many who disagreed with her, even within her own party, and those of us who are unionists in Northern Ireland disagreed with her on occasions, particularly in relation to the Anglo-Irish agreement. But whatever our views, people today, by and large, must accept, acknowledge and admire her as a politician, a statesperson of conviction. For her, the days of focus groups, the amorphous middle, the soft imaging, none of that would have suited her. How many times have we heard it said during her lifetime and since that, like her or loathe her, at least you knew where Maggie stood, and people admire that in their politicians. And that's certainly something that people want to see. Part of her attraction was that she was seen as taking on the vested interest, the political establishment. She was impatient of the old brigade, prepared to shake things up. But like all great human beings and all great politicians, she was a woman of contradictions. Very often her rhetoric didn't match up to the actions. Her instincts were blunted. She did become persuaded on some issues against her better judgment. On Europe, she is rightly lauded for the action she took, for instance, in relation to securing our rebate, for her stance against European federalism, for her Bruges speech, for her stance in defence of our currency. And yet she did sign and implement the Single European Act, which many see as the forerunner of the Maastricht Agreement. And on Northern Ireland, again, she was full of contradictions. Those of us in these benches in the DUP, and indeed the entire unionist community in Northern Ireland in the 80s, opposed the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and indeed many honourable and right honourable members on the Conservative benches and others opposed it as well. Once she had said that Ulster was as British as Finchley. Once she said rightly that it was out, out, out to a united Ireland, a federal Ireland or joint authority. And yet a year later, in 1985, she signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement without any consultation with the entire unionist community and without their consent. The reason that so many unionists felt so strongly and spoke so strongly at that time, and that there are still strong feelings about that era, is that they remembered her strong stance during the hunger strikes, when she stood up in defence of democracy and against terrorism, when she had suffered the loss, as the Prime Minister and others have referred to, of her close colleagues due to terrorism, when she herself just a year before had survived an IRA assassination attempt, and yet she was persuaded to sign the Anglo-Irish Agreement. I am glad that in her later life she came to recognise that that was a mistake. That just as Lord Powell, her former close adviser, said the other night in Newsnight, it said of Mary, Queen of Scots, that the words Calais were inscribed in her heart, so he believed that the words the Anglo-Irish Agreement would be inscribed in the heart of Margaret Thatcher, because she became increasingly disillusioned with that agreement. People say, but was it not the template for the future that we now have in Ulster? I say it isn't that template because you can't base a future on exclusion. And I say that as a unionist in Northern Ireland with all of our history. We must go forward with the inclusion of all communities. And today there's very little of the Anglo-Irish agreement left. Today we have a settlement in Northern Ireland which has been consulted and has the consent and agreement of both communities in Northern Ireland. And I'm glad that that is now what we have as opposed to the previous approach. Mr. Speaker, I want to close by saying that we had our disagreements, yes, with Margaret Thatcher, but she was fundamentally, instinctively and truly a great patriot, a great unionist, a great Briton. And that is why we are right to pay tribute to her today, recognising her faults, recognising the divisions that are there. Of course there are divisions, but there were divisions long before Margaret Thatcher, and there will be divisions long after in other eras as well. It is not unique. I hear today Gerry Adams and others talk about the legacy of Margaret Thatcher as if she and the British government, the British state, created the violence in Northern Ireland. The fact is, of course, that the hunger strikers were in jail and were convicted of terrorist acts long before she came to office. And those who are out on our streets in Belfast and elsewhere in the United Kingdom, in Glasgow, Bristol or wherever it is, engaging in the sort of ghoulish celebrations, obscene acts which I think appall the entire nation. They should think again of her words, because she once said that she took great solace in those who hated her so much, because she knew then that she was doing what was right and that they hated her for that. Mr. Speaker, we must remember Margaret Thatcher for the great things that she has done for our country, not remembering her with rose-tinted spectacles or through rose-tinted spectacles, especially those of us in Ulster. But it is right that we do mark her period in office and her life as being one of enormous contribution, an everlasting memorial to democracy and to freedom in this country and across the world.
Sir Malcolm Rifkin.
I was privileged, along with my right honourable friend, the member for Rushcliffe, to serve in Margaret Thatcher's government for the full 11 years of her term of office and to be in her cabinet for almost half that time. And, you know, it was never dull. Each day we saw political leadership and statesmanship of the highest order. And each day we saw a Prime Minister with remarkable personal qualities. It was sometimes said that she didn't have a sense of humour. And it's true, there was very little wit in many of her speeches. But I recall on one occasion she was asked, Mrs. Thatcher, do you believe in consensus? And to our surprise, we heard her saying, yes, I do believe in consensus. There should be a consensus behind my convictions. I thought at the time this was an extraordinary example of wit, but as the years have gone by, I've realised that she was actually being deadly serious. It was also said that she could be very intolerant with those who didn't agree with her. That was also a parody of the truth. She was intolerant of people who were woolly, who argued that things couldn't be done because they'd be unpopular, or that it was too difficult. But when she met someone who actually was able to argue from a point of fact and whom she respected, then she not only listened and could change her mind. I was moved to the Foreign Office at the time of the Falklands, and she recalled Sir Anthony Parsons, our ambassador at the Security Council, to ask him how it was going at the United Nations. He'd never met her before. He was a rather grand diplomat. And when he started trying to report to her, she, not uncharacteristically, kept interrupting him. And he wasn't used to this. And after the fourth interruption, he stopped. And he said, Prime Minister, if you didn't interrupt me so often, you might find that you didn't need to. She not only kept quiet, but 6 months later appointed him her foreign policy advisor. Now, of course, she was a great leader of the Conservative Party. But, you know, people are entitled to ask, was she actually a Conservative? Doesn't the word Conservative normally mean someone who is rather wedded to tradition, cautious of change, unwilling to act too precipitately? And yet she was the most radical Prime Minister of the last few generations. There is nevertheless a consistency between these two statements, because what she had recognised was that Britain had gone the wrong way, it had taken the wrong path for 20 or 30 years, and that needed change. And that's what made her radical. Many honourable members will know that great novel, The Leopard, by Giuseppe de Lampedusa, where the hero says, if you want things to stay the same, things will have to change. And that very much was her belief. I am conscious of the fact, having spent a lot of my time in the Foreign Office, that diplomats in the Foreign Office were not her favourite department. I went to see her when I was Defence Secretary some years later, after she had retired. And she said to me, you know, Ministry of Defence, your problem is you've got no allies. The Foreign Office, she said, they're not wet, they're drenched. She had a remarkable capacity when it came to the Foreign Office and to diplomats, sometimes to distance herself from the government of which she was Prime Minister. On one glorious occasion, which I was personally involved in, we'd had a difficult negotiation getting a package of sanctions against South Africa, which did not include economic sanctions. But she was very unhappy that one of the proposals at the European Community Council was that we should withdraw our defence attaches. The Ministry of Defence didn't mind, but it took an awful long time for Geoffrey Howe to persuade her to go along with us, and she really was basically unconvinced, but went along with it. Some weeks later, we had a visit from the President of Mozambique, and I was asked to sit in on the meeting at Downing Street. And the President rebuked her for not doing enough against apartheid in South Africa. Now, I'll never forget her response. She bridled. She said, Mr. President, that is simply not the case. We are refusing to sell arms to South Africa. We have initiated the Gleneagles Agreement, whereby we don't have any sporting contact with South Africa. We're using all the diplomatic means to try and bring down apartheid. We. And then suddenly she stopped, pointed at me and said, they've decided to withdraw our defence attaches. Adding the words, don't know what good that will do, but... And the President of Mozambique was rather bemused at what would seem to be happening. But although she may have had mixed feelings about the Foreign Office, actually, she owed a great debt of gratitude to the Foreign Office. Because one of her greatest triumphs, her relationship with Mr. Gorbachev and what flowed from that, was as a result of the diplomats in the Foreign Office spotting at a very early stage that this youngest new member of the Politburo, Mikhail Gorbachev, was a man to try and cultivate. And she had the wisdom to accept their advice. And what followed from that, we should not underestimate. Because what followed from that, and the way in which she persuaded Ronald Reagan to accept her view that Gorbachev was a man with whom we could do business. Reagan, forgive me, would not have accepted that advice from most people. But coming from the Iron Lady, he said, well, if she believes that, then I can proceed on that basis. And the result was not only a remarkable set of initiatives, but the end of the Cold War and the liberation of Eastern Europe without a shot being fired. And that was a remarkable epitaph. I don't want to speak for too long. I just want to make one other point, though. And it is this, that one of the big issues, is relevant to the debates we have today, is that in the relationship with the United States, do British Prime Ministers have to always agree with the President, otherwise we risk that relationship? Well, all I can tell you is Margaret Thatcher had no doubt the answer was no, you don't have to. On several occasions, she had deep disagreements with Ronald Reagan, one of her closest friends. For example, on the question of the Soviet oil pipeline in the early 1980s, where British companies had got contracts to help build it, the Americans threatened sanctions against British companies. And Margaret Thatcher bitterly criticised them. I was sent off to Washington as a junior minister to have meetings with Mr. Kenneth Dam, the American Deputy Secretary of State. We reached a compromise. The only thing we couldn't agree on was whether the compromise would be known as the Rifkin-Dam Agreement or the Dam-Rifkin Agreement. She openly and publicly disagreed with Reagan on the Reykjavik summit when she felt he was surrendering too many nuclear weapons without getting enough in return. But most important of all, she bitterly resented the invasion of Grenada. You recall, the House will recall, that Grenada was invaded by the United States, who had forgotten, unfortunately, that Her Majesty was the head of state of Grenada. and had not even informed the British government of what they were about to do. And she not only criticised them, but she went on the BBC World Service attacking the United States, saying they cannot behave like this. And some days later, Reagan recorded in his memoirs, he was sitting in the Oval Office with some of his aides, and he was told the British Prime Minister was on the phone, would he take a call? And of course he said, yes, of course he would. And she started berating him in a rather strident way down the telephone. It only went on for about a minute, but some of us who've been on the receiving end knows how long that can feel like. And when she was in full flight, Reagan put his hand over the receiver so she couldn't hear, turned to his aides and said, gee, isn't she marvellous? So far from resenting it, they of course appreciated that sometimes you get it wrong, and even your closest allies are entitled to point that out. I conclude by saying that Margaret Thatcher was someone who did not worry, as has been already remarked, on people being rude about her. The term Iron Lady was first coined by the Soviets as an insult, and she of course took it on as a badge of pride. Dennis Healey referred to her memorably as Attila the Hen. François Mitterrand famously said she had the eyes of Caligula and the lips of Marilyn Monroe. She took them all as a compliment, because she asked for no quarter and she certainly gave none. I shall next Wednesday, this Wednesday, in 2 days' time, next week, forgive me, next week, be at the funeral in St. Paul's. I was at Churchill's funeral in St. Paul's. Well, that's not quite the whole truth. I was actually an 18-year-old student who'd hitchhiked down to London and spent the night on the pavement and watched the arrival at St. Paul's Cathedral. We will honour the other great Prime Minister of the last 50, 60, 70 years, Margaret Thatcher, in a similar way. And that is something which not only we can be proud of, the country can be proud of, but the whole world has a debt to her, which they very fully recognise as well.
We would actually like to be modernised, and those were the new industries that we were moving over
Let me interrupt you. Stick with us, Ben. Yeah. I want to go back to the Conors. This is Conor Burns, who was very close, right to her dying days, to Margaret Thatcher. Conor Burns in the comments.
And kindness to her on that occasion. She'd come back from so many health scares that we sort of thought she'd go on forever. In the words of the poem, if I had thought thou couldst have died, I might not weep for thee. But I forgot when by thy side that thou couldst mortal be. As I have watched the coverage of this remarkable lady on the television, I have also felt a deep sense of personal loss. Some of us have lost a dear friend, and someone who in my case was not only a friend, but a mentor, a protectress, someone I loved and cared for very deeply. I first met Margaret Thatcher back in 1992 in Southampton-Itchen, the then constituency of my honourable friend and neighbour, the member for Christchurch, when she came to support him. And over the years, she has been enormously supportive in my efforts to get elected to this place. I remember in 2001 when she came to support me in Eastleigh, and we took her to a health club, covered live on Sky News. The chief executive of the entire group had come to welcome her, and she announced to him that these places are a complete waste of time. Up and down stairs keeps me fit. In 2002, Mr. Speaker, I must have had the unique privilege of welcoming Ted Heath and Margaret Thatcher to Eastleigh in the same month, and I warned the people in my association when Ted was coming, for goodness sake, don't put out the Thatcher Tebbit flyers. Well, they did. Ted reached for one of them and looked at it and said to me, "What on earth are you doing with those two?" I said, well, they agreed to come. And he came to say what I suppose for him was a grudging compliment. Well, I suppose it's something of a coup. She came down to Eastleigh again in 2005. Alas, that was not to be, and Chris Hoon won. In January 2010, in the run-up to the general election, she did what turned out to be the last dinner she ever had outside her home or the Ritz, where she came to do an event for me and another candidate, which we rather novelly entitled Women for Men to Win. Anne Widdecombe was the guest speaker and Margaret was the guest of honour. But, Mr. Speaker, it is, I think, the Sunday evenings that I spent with Lady Thatcher in recent years. Almost every Sunday. I often bumped into you, Mr. Speaker, on my way to Chester Square to see her when you were returning from the gym. We had very... We had great conversations on those Sundays, and they ranged very much dependent on how she was on a particular day. If we were in good form, we'd go through the papers and we'd have a look at what was in them. I remember last November showing her a poll in the Sunday Telegraph that showed the Conservatives 9% behind the Labour Party. She asked when the next election was. So I said it was a little over 2 years to go. And she said, "That's not far enough behind at this stage." I did indeed. I did indeed, from the living room of Chester Square, text this piece of information to the Prime Minister. I don't know whether that cheered up his Sunday evening at Chequers. I'm sure it reduced my prospects of promotion. Mr. Speaker, there was one occasion when I took a taxi from here to Chester Square to see her. It was a particularly wet and awful evening. And I asked the taxi driver to take me to Chester Square, and he said, "Which end of the square do you want, Gov?" I said, the house with the policeman outside." "Maggie Thatcher's, Gov." I said, "That's right." He said, "What are you doing there then?" I said, "I'm going to have a drink with her. She's a friend of mine." "What do you do then?" I said, "I'm a Tory MP. And as we pulled up, I went to pay the fare, and he refused to take the fare. And I apologise in advance to the Prime Minister for repeating this story. He said, "Your fare tonight, Gov, is you go in there and you tell her from me, we ain't had a good un since." Mr. Speaker, I imparted this message to Margaret, who looked at me and said, "Well, he's quite right." I then was on the receiving end of a lecture about how he probably had a wife and child to support and I should have paid him, and it was monstrous that I didn't. Mr. Speaker, one of the things we used to talk about was her time in office and some of the remarkable achievements that she had. And I remember on one occasion, quite recently, towards the end of last year, saying to her, "Well, you must have made mistakes." And she said, "Well, I suppose I must have done." And I said, "Can you think of any specific examples?" And she replied, "Well, they usually happen when I didn't get my own way." Mr. Speaker, much has been made in the media about the controversial nature of Margaret Thatcher as a politician and of her premiership. And we should not shy away from that today, and nor should we on these benches be afraid to talk about that. That would be to betray who she was. She was a robust, principled, confrontational character. Yes, she divided. Yes, she pursued her policies with vigour and with persistence. She believed, as she said to me, politics at its purest is philosophy in action. She believed in the battle of ideas, something that we would welcome returning to the domestic politics today. She wasn't, if I may say so, to the Deputy Prime Minister, she wasn't a Tory at all. In fact, she proudly stated that she was a laissez-faire Gladstonian economic liberal. In the proudest traditions, and I say it as one myself, of the Gladstonian Liberal Party, and she would have welcomed that. But I think, the protests, in some way, are actually the greatest compliment that could be paid to Margaret Thatcher. That even in death, the left have to argue against her. She would take great pride in these protests. She wouldn't get angry about them. She would regard them as utterly and completely absurd. And all I would say to those engaged in them, look at how gracious she was in always what she said when her political foes departed the scene, most recently in the statement that she issued about Michael Foot. Her enduring legacy is not just in what she achieved and the fact that the Labour Party haven't reversed much of it. Her true legacy lies here on these benches and those who are coming up behind us. After the 2010 general election, I had the honour of organising a small number of receptions to introduce her to new colleagues. And she drew great solace and comfort from the number of those colleagues who told her that they were in Parliament because of her inspiration and because of what she believed and did. Even only 2 years ago, Tony Abbott, the aspirant Prime Minister of Australia, asking to come and see her and telling her that his philosophy was informed by watching what she had done when he was at university. Mr. Speaker, I want to end with this, because while she was a divisive to some degree, controversial certainly, she was an inspiration to many people way beyond these shores. And I'd like to end by just quoting what she said in the closing pages of the second volume of her memoirs, the last authentic book that she published, where she reflected a visit in 1993 to Warsaw, and where she wrote movingly about attending Mass at the Church of the Holy Cross. And she wrote of that occasion, "Every nook and cranny was packed, and the choral singing of unfamiliar Polish hymns was all the more uplifting because I could not understand the verses. It forced me to try to imagine what the congregation was asking of God. Foreign though this experience was, it also gave me a comforting feeling that I was but one soul among many in a fellowship of believers that crossed nations and denominations." When the priest rose to give the sermon, however, I had the sense that I had suddenly become the centre of attention. Heads turned and people smiled at me. As the priest began, someone translated his words. He recalled that during the dark days of communism, they had been aware of voices from the outside world, offering hope of a different and better life. The voices were many, often eloquent, and all were welcome to a people starved so long of truth as well as freedom. But Poles had come to identify with one voice in particular, my own, even when that voice had been relayed through the distorting loudspeaker of the Soviet propaganda. They had heard through the distortions the message of truth and hope. Well, communism had fallen and a new democratic order had replaced it. But they had not fully felt the change, nor truly believed in its reality, until today, when they finally saw me in their own church. The priest finished his sermon and the service continued, but the kindness of the priest and the parishioners had not been exhausted. At the end of Mass, I was invited to stand in front of the altar. When I did so, lines of children presented me with little bouquets, while their mothers and fathers applauded. Mr. Speaker, the final paragraph of Lady Thatcher's memoirs reads thus: Of course, no human mind, nor any conceivable computer, can calculate the sum total of my career in politics in terms of happiness, achievement, and virtue, nor indeed of their opposites. It follows, therefore, that the full accounting of how my political work affected the lives of others is something we will only know on Judgment Day. It is an awesome and unsettling thought, but it comforts me that when I stand up to hear the verdict, I will at least have the people of the Church of the Holy Cross in Warsaw in court as character witnesses.